Understanding trauma is one of the key points of the cheat code method. And it's one of the first steps in being able to overcome and put to rest some of your trauma that might be blocking you from making massive changes in your life. The first thing we want to do is really try to understand, where does this trauma come from? But then also, how do we clear it? So this is a lesson based on how we understand what's happened to us, better understand how we can look at it, understand our patterns, and where we want to go. As a child, we really start with a couple of emotions. When you're very young, a baby really cries and it laughs, and that's about the two things that it does from an emotional standpoint. As it grows up and gets to a toddler and older, you notice that it starts to develop more emotions, like we have listed here. A child can move very quickly between these emotions. And so they have the capability to be happy and then crying, and then move from crying to happy again very quickly. And as we grow as adults, we obviously don't want to be able to waffle through our emotions so quickly. Um, and a lot of us have issues with trying to implement things in our lives as adults, and we don't seem to have great success with it. I love to use the example of working out. You know, a lot of people try to work out and they go and put this habit in place, and for some reason, after a couple of months, they fall off or don't stick with it. And my challenges, and this is what I've learned with my capabilities of creating this program and implementing it in my own life, is a lot of what my hangups and holdbacks were based in childhood trauma. And trauma is a very broad term, and I like to use it, but it is not specific to one type of thing. There's small traumas and big traumas. So I'll give you an example. A small trauma for me when I was growing up, I was raised in the FLDS, which was a polygamous cult in Utah, and my dad had multiple wives. And when I was younger, 5 years old, my mom had told me, I recall, that, I wasn't supposed to tell people that my other mom was my mom. I was supposed to tell them that she was my aunt. And we also wore some pretty distinct clothing. And I was told that we shouldn't tell people what church we're a part of. Now, my mom wasn't doing anything wrong, and she really wasn't trying to be divisive at all. She was trying to do the best she could for her children in the situation she was in. However, as a young child, I didn't really understand why she was telling me to do this. I didn't know what church we were a part of. I didn't know why it was bad to have two wives, but I took on some shame from that. And the shame ultimately caused me to have in later in life caused me to have insecurities about myself, and that I wasn't good enough or that I didn't belong in certain groups. And it was really challenging for me to transition into society from that religion, because I had a lot of um, unvalid beliefs about myself. So as a child, when we experience these types of things, what happens is the subconscious walls off those emotions. And it can happen with many emotions like fear and sadness and anger, and they all get walled off. And so what that does is that prevents us from accessing them correctly. And so what this does to us in long term is we can experience very traumatic trauma as a child, or even some more, I would say, low level traumas, but they still affect how we behave, because that below 7 years old, you're really establishing your core characteristics and personality that you will be as an adult. And so that's really that seed that's being planted. So they can be small things that can grow into really big disorders and challenges. And for me, I developed really bad alcoholism and really had a tough time in adulthood, and really almost got to the point, and did get to the point of suicide, before I was able to pull myself out and really develop this program and method in order to help myself heal. So what happens is, when we become adults and we have these traumas that are still haunting us as children, we become walled off from our emotions. And as you can see here, this is a reflection of something that I went through, where I only had really one type of coping mechanism, and that was to drink. And so, got in an argument with my boss, I would go drink. Got in an argument with my partner, I would go drink. Wasn't getting along with my family, I would go drink. anything that happened to me, I would just go and medicate with drinking. I would just numb myself, because ultimately what I didn't understand at the time is that I was trying to cope, but because I didn't have access to these emotions, I didn't know how to cope. So I was in survival mode, and I would go to the thing that I understood how to cope, which was drinking, which drinking didn't solve the problem. It just numbed the problem. And so the challenge with drinking that you get in a vicious cycle with is you go and drink and you feel good for a couple of hours, but then you have to deal with the hangover and maybe some stupid stuff you did along the way. And it becomes this vicious cycle. And so what happens is, as adults, we get in this trauma cycle where we have a tough emotion come. Because we're blocked off from our emotions, we then go into one of these types of coping mechanisms. And it doesn't have to just be alcohol. It could be overeating, or Netflix, or shopping, or whenever these things. But when we feel something that we don't know how to handle, we go into a coping mechanism that we've learned, and it's not necessarily a effective coping mechanism or something that actually solves the problem. And so what I found myself in was this loop of trauma that I would just go in over and over and over. And the problem is, it continued to got worse and worse and worse. Every time I would have an issue, I would drink, and then I would go further, I would go longer, I would go greater benders, I would do more things that were not becoming of me and really not who I wanted to be. But at the time, I just didn't understand what it was that was preventing me from changing. And ultimately, what I came to find was the problem was not the alcohol. The alcohol was my solution to the problem. The problem was I had these unaddressed traumas as a child and in my young adulthood that I had not addressed, and I didn't know how to address. And so I wasn't able to move on from them. So I just was stuck in this cycle, which ultimately led me to almost killing myself. Now, the goal here too is, see, a lot of people say, hey, time heals all wounds. And I don't necessarily believe that. And because the challenge is this: if I don't go and address that old wound, it builds up within me, and I continue to experience certain types of trauma as an adult, and they continue to build and build and build. If I try to shove them down or just say, I'm going to move on, I'll move past it, it'll go away. It does not go away. And what I mean by that is, it's not something that comes up directly related to that particular trauma, but it comes out in other ways. So the example is, I had stuff that I didn't understand about my childhood, and I had not moved on from it. And it was really causing me problems, but it was subconsciously causing me problems. And so it came out in bad behavior, drinking and anger, and really bad behavior that ultimately just kept coming out. And I didn't understand why I kept repeating these patterns over and over, but it was because I didn't know how to address the trauma. So the process in which I have taken myself through, and I've taken others through, and I want to take you through, is we need to establish a way that, one, we can go back and address the traumas that we've had, but then also create a process for addressing challenges and trauma when they come up. Because the idea here is that just because you solve your past doesn't mean your future isn't going to have challenges. And the biggest problem that people have, and the reason they fall into that cycle, is because maybe they do good for a while. Like, I quit drinking for 3 months and I thought, oh, everything's good. The problem is I didn't have a way to deal with the traumas and the new challenges that were coming my way. So I would just default back to the old stuff, and I would fall off the wagon and I would drink again. And so what we want to do is we want to understand how, when a challenge arises, we can have a healthy conversation with ourselves. We know the process we have to go through in order to address something and how to feel the emotion. And then, instead of going to those things that are destructive, like drinking and overeating and things like that, we establish a way to have a base and a rock solid foundation of coping mechanisms that will help us understand the problem and overcome it and move on from it, and not push it down and not let it boil up and burst out at a later date. I will teach you how to do this in my program. So at the end of the day, we are someone who can experience all the emotions, instead of that person that was walled off in the brick wall and couldn't access any of these emotions. See, the secret to life is not being happy all the time. The secret to life is having the capability to experience all the emotions in the proper way that they're supposed to. If my, mother was to die or something like that, I'm going to feel sad. Even if I'm the most enlightened person in the world, I'm going to feel sad. I understand how to feel that feeling. I understand how to process that emotion. I use my coping mechanisms to go through that emotion and put it to rest, so that 6 and 8 months down the road, I'm not coming up with that same problem and that same issue, and then having the challenge of trying to deal with it and using a bad coping mechanism to avoid it and not ultimately solve the problem. So this is just one of the many lessons that I have in my program that are going to help you really have this massive self-discovery. And what it's done for me is completely transformed my life. I went from a suicidal alcoholic to a happy, dedicated father with very balanced emotions. And now I'm doing everything I can to help others get to that same place. I would love to work with you. Please take a look at my website and let's go forward.